We always hate seeing the end of a book. And today, friends, Kiyaya and I are going to be sharing with you the final chapters of James Henry Trotter's excursion with his insect friends on that giant peach in Roald Dahl's book, James and the Giant Peach. That's right, Kiyaya. I can't wait to see what happens to them in these final chapters. Sit back, relax, get cozy. It's story time with Kiyaya and Daniel. Oh, hi. It's Daniel and Kiyaya, and we are so excited that we're going to be launching on Rude Rangers TV, Crafty Conversations with Kiyaya and Daniel. If you're a crafter of any kind, cross-stitching, needlepoint, pottery, music, acting, baking, mixology, cooking, everything is a craft, we want to have a crafty conversation with you and tell us about your journey and teach us a few things along the way. Please, if you are interested in applying to be on this great new show, please go to www.STITCHINGwolfDesigns.com and apply today. Kiyaya and I can't wait to have some crafty conversations with all of you. Again, apply today. www.STITCHINGwolfDesigns.com. Stories are such an important part of our lives. Join my friend Kiyaya and I for Get Cozy, because it's story time with Kiyaya and Daniel, where we share some of the greatest picture books and chapters from children's and young adult literature to inspire you to keep embedding literacy into your days. Chapter 32. And when full daylight came, at last, they all got to their feet and stretched their poor, cramped bodies, and then the centipede, who always seemed to see things first, shouted, "Look! There's land below!" "He's right," they cried, running to the edge of the peach and peering over. "Hooray! Hooray! It looks like streets and houses, but how enormous it all is!" A vast city glistening in the early morning sunshine lay spread out 3,000 feet below them. At that height, the cars were like little beetles crawling along streets, and people walking on the pavements looked no larger than grains of soot. "But what tremendous tall buildings!" exclaimed the ladybug. "I've never seen anything like them before in England. Which town do you think it is?" "This couldn't possibly be England," said the old green grasshopper. "Then where is it?" said Miss Spider. "You know what those buildings are," shouted James, jumping up and down with excitement. "Those are skyscrapers! So this must be America! And that, my friends, means that we have crossed the Atlantic Ocean overnight." "You don't mean it!" they cried. "It's not possible! It's incredible! It's unbelievable!" "Oh, I've always dreamed about going to America," cried the centipede. "I have a friend once who—" "Be quiet," said the earthworm. Who cares about your friend? The thing we got to think about now is how on earth are we going to get down to Earth?" "Ask James," said the ladybug. "I don't think that should be so very difficult," James told them. "All we have to do is cut loose a few seagulls. Not too many, mind you, but just enough so that the others can't quite keep us up in the air. Then down we shall go slowly and gently until we reach the ground. Centipede will bite through the string for us one at a time." Chapter 33. Far below them in the city of New York, something like pandemonium was breaking out. A great round ball as big as a house had been sighted hovering high up in the sky over the very center of Manhattan. And the cry had gone up that it was an enormous bomb sent over by another country to blow the whole city to smithereens. Air raid sirens began wailing in every section. All radio and television programs were interrupted with announcements that the population must go down into their cellars immediately. 1 million people walking in the streets on their way to work looked up into the sky and saw the monster hovering above them and started running for the nearest subway entrance to take cover. Generals grabbed hold of telephones and shouted orders to everyone they could think of. The mayor of New York called up the President of the United States down in Washington, D.C. to ask him for help. And the President, who at that moment was having breakfast in his pajamas, quickly pushed away his half-finished plate of Sugar Crisps and started pressing buttons right and left to summon his admirals and generals. And all the way across the vast stretch of America in all 50 states, from Alaska to Florida, from Pennsylvania to Hawaii, the alarm was sounded, and the world went out that the biggest bomb in the history of the world was hovering over New York City, and at any moment it might go off. Chapter 34. "Come on, Centipede, bite through the first string," James ordered. The centipede took one of the silk strings between his teeth and bit through it. And once again, but not with an angry cloudman dangling from the end of the string this time, a single seagull came away from the rest of the flock and went flying off on its own. "Bite another," James ordered. The centipede bit through another string. "Why aren't we sinking?" "We are sinking!" "No, we're not." "Don't forget the peach is a lot lighter now than when we started out," James told them. "It lost an awful lot of juice when all those hailstones hit it in the night. Cut away 2 more seagulls, Centipede." "Ah, that's better. Here we go. Now we're really sinking." "Yes, this is perfect. Don't bite any more, Centipede, or we'll sink too fast." "Gently does it." Slowly, the great peach began losing height, and the buildings and streets down below began coming closer and closer. "Do you think we'll get all our pictures in the papers when we get down?" the ladybug asked. "My goodness, I've forgotten to polish my boots," the centipede said. "Everyone must help me to polish my boots before we arrive." "Oh, for heaven's sake," said the earthworm. "Can't you ever stop thinking about—" But he never finished his sentence, for suddenly, whoosh! And they looked up and saw a huge 4-engine plane come shooting out of a nearby cloud, go whizzing past them, not more than 20 feet above their heads. This was actually the regular early morning passenger plane coming into New York from Chicago. And as it went by, it sliced right through every single one of the silken strings, and immediately the seagulls broke away, and the enormous peach, having nothing to hold it up in the air any longer, went tumbling down toward the earth like a lump of lead. "Help!" cried the centipede. "Save us!" cried Miss Spider. "We are lost!" cried the ladybug. "This is the end!" cried the old green grasshopper. "James!" cried the earthworm. "Do something, James! Quickly do something!" "I can't!" cried James. "I'm sorry! Goodbye! Shut your eyes, everybody! It won't be long now!" Chapter 35. Round and upside down went the peach as it plummeted towards the earth, and they were all clinging desperately to the stem to save themselves from being flung into space. Faster and faster it fell, down and down and down, racing closer and closer to the houses and streets below, where it would surely smash into 1,000,000 pieces when it hit. And all the way along Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue, and along all the other streets in the city, people who had not yet reached the underground shelters looked up and saw it coming, and they stopped running and stood there staring in a sort of a stupor at what they thought was the biggest bomb in all the world falling out of the skies onto their heads. A few women screamed, others knelt down on the sidewalks and began praying aloud. Strong men turned to one another and said something like, "I guess this is it, Joe. And goodbye, everybody. Goodbye." And for the next 30 seconds, the whole city held its breath, waiting for the end to come. Chapter 36. "Goodbye, Ladybug," gasped James, clinging to the stem of the falling peach. "Goodbye, Centipede. Goodbye, everybody." There were only a few seconds to go now, and it looked as though they were going to fall right in among all the tallest buildings. And James could see the skyscrapers rushing up to meet them at the most awful speed. Most of them had square tops, but the very tallest of them all had a top that tapered off into a long, sharp point, like an enormous silver needle sticking up into the sky. And it was precisely onto the top of this needle that the peach fell. There was a squelch. The needle went in deep, and suddenly there was the giant peach, caught and spiked upon the very pinnacle of the Empire State Building. Chapter 37. It was really an amazing sight, and in 2 or 3 minutes, as soon as the people below realized that this now couldn't possibly be a bomb, they came pouring out of the shelters and the subways to gape at the marvel. The streets for half a mile around the building were jammed with men and women, and when the word spread that they were actually living things moving about on the top of the great round ball, then everyone went wild with excitement. "It's a flying saucer!" they shouted. "They are from outer space! Men from Mars! Or maybe they came from the moon!" And a man who had a pair of binoculars to his eyes said, "They look pretty peculiar to me." And I'll tell you that for sure. Police cars and fire engines came screaming in from all over the city and pulled up outside the Empire State Building. 200 firemen and 600 policemen swarmed into the building and went up in the elevators as high as they could go. Then they poured out onto the observation roof, which is the place where tourists stand, just at the bottom of the big spike. All the policemen were holding their guns at the ready with their fingers on the triggers, and the firemen were clutching their hatchets. But from where they stood almost directly underneath the peach, they couldn't actually see the travelers on top. "Ahoy there!" shouted the chief of police. "Come out and show yourselves!" Suddenly, the great brown head of the centipede appeared over the side of the peach. His black eyes, as large and round as 2 marbles, glared down at the policemen and the firemen below. Then his monstrous, ugly face broke out in a big, wide grin. The policemen and the firemen all started shouting at once. "Look out!" they cried. "It's a dragon!" "It's not a dragon, it's a wampus! It's a gorgon, a serpent, a proc! It's a manticore!" 3 firemen and 5 policemen fainted and had to be carried away. "It's a snozwonger!" cried the chief of police. "It's a wangdoodle!" yelled the head of the fire department. The centipede kept on grinning. He screamed. He seemed to be enjoying himself enormously. The commotion that he was causing was amazing. "Now see here," shouted the chief of police, cupping his hands to his mouth. "You listen to me. I want you to tell me exactly where you've come from." "We've come from thousands of miles away," the centipede shouted back, grinning more broadly than ever and showing his brown teeth. "There you are," cried the chief of police. "I told you they came from Mars." "I guess you're right," said the head of the fire department. At this point, the old green grasshopper poked his huge green head over the side of the peach alongside the centipede's. 6 more big, strong men fainted when they saw him. "That one's an oink!" screamed the head of the fire department. "I just know it's an oink!" "Or a cockatrice," yelled the chief of police. "Stand back, men. It may jump down on us at any moment." "What on earth are they talking about?" said the old green grasshopper to the centipede. "Search me," the centipede answered, "but they seem to be in an awful stew about something." Then Miss Spider's large, black, murderous-looking head, which to a stranger was probably the most terrifying of all, appeared next to the grasshopper. "Snakes and ladders!" yelled the head of the fire department. "We're finished now. It's a giant scorpula!" "It's worse than that!" cried the chief of police. "It's a vermicious canid!" "Oh, just look at its vermicious, gruesome face." "Is it the kind that eats fully grown men for breakfast?" asked the fire department, going white as a sheet. "I'm afraid it is," said the chief of police. "Oh, please, why doesn't someone help us to get down from here?" Miss Spider called out. "It's making me giddy." "This could be a trick," said the chief head of the fire department. "Don't anyone make a move until I say so." "They've probably got space guns," muttered the chief of police. "But we've got to do something," the head of the fire department announced grimly. "About 5 million people are standing down there on the streets watching us." "Then why don't you put up a ladder?" the chief of police asked him. "I'll stand at the bottom and hold it steady for you while you go up and see what's happening." "Thanks very much," snapped the head of the fire department. Soon there were no less than 7 large, fantastic faces peering down over the side of the peach. The centipedes, the old green grasshoppers, the spiders, the earthworms, the ladybugs, the silkworms, and the glowworms. And a sort of a panic was beginning to break out among the firemen and the policemen on the rooftop. Then, all at once, the panic stopped, and a great gasp of astonishment went up all around, for now a small boy was seen to be standing up there besides the other creatures. His hair was blowing in the wind, and he was laughing and waving and calling out, "Hello, everybody! Hello!" For a few moments, the men below just stood and stared and gasped. They simply couldn't believe their eyes. "Bless my soul," cried the head of the fire department, going red in the face. "It really is a little boy, isn't it?" "Don't be frightened of us, please," James called out. "We are so glad to be here." "What about those others beside you?" shouted the chief of police. "Are any of them dangerous?" "Of course they're not dangerous," James answered. "They're the nicest creatures in the world. Allow me to introduce them to you one by one, and then I'm sure you will believe me. My friends, this is the centipede, and let me make it known. He's so sweet and gentle that although he's overgrown, the Queen of Spain again and again has summoned him by phone to babysit and sing and knit and be a chaperone when nurse is off and all the royal children are alone. Small wonder," said a fireman, "they're no longer on the throne." "The earthworm, on the other hand," said James, beginning to expand, "is great for digging up the land and making old soils newer. Moreover, you should understand, he would be absolutely grand for digging subway tunnels and for making you a sewer." The earthworm blushed and beamed with pride. Miss Spider clapped and cheered and cried, "Could any words be truer?" And the grasshopper, ladies and gents, is a boon in millions and millions of ways. You only have to ask him to give you a tune, and he plays and he plays and he plays. As a toy for your children is perfectly sweet. There's nothing so good in the shops. You've only to tickle the soles of his feet. And he hops and he hops and he hops. He can't be very fierce, exclaimed the head of all the cops. And now, without excuse, I'd like to introduce this charming glowworm, lover of simplicity. She's easy to install on your ceiling or on your wall. And although this smacks a bit of eccentricity, it's really rather clever, for thereafter you will never, never have the slightest need for using electricity. At which no less than 52 policemen cried, "If this is true, this creature'll sure to get some great publicity." And here we have Miss Spider, with a mile of thread inside her, who has personally requested me to say that she's never met Miss Muffet on her tiny, charming little tuffet. If she had, she'd not have frightened her away. Okay, don't laugh at me, Kiyaya. Should her looks sometimes alarm you, that I don't think it would harm you to repeat at least 100 times a day, I must never kill a spider. I must only help and guide her, and invite her in the nursery to play. The police all nodded slightly, and the firemen smiled politely, and about a dozen people cried, "Hooray!" And here's my darling ladybug, so beautiful, so kind, my greatest comfort since this trip began. She has 400 children, and she's left them all behind. But they're coming on the next peach if they can. The cops cried she's entrancing, all the firemen started dancing, and the crowds all started cheering to a man. And now the silkworm, James went on, whose silk will bear comparison with all the greatest silks there are in Rome and Philadelphia. If you would search the whole world through, from Paraguay to Timbuktu, I don't think you would find one bit of silk that could compare with it. Even in the shops in Singapore don't have the stuff. And what is more, the silkworm had, I'll have you know, the honor not so long ago to spin and weave and so impress the Queen of England's wedding dress. And she's already made and sent a waistcoat for your president. Well, good for her, the cops cried out, and all at once a mighty shout went up around the Empire State. Let's get them down at once. Why wait? Chapter 38. 5 minutes later, they were all safely down, and James was excitedly telling his story to a group of flabbergasted officials. And suddenly, everyone who had come over on the Peach was a hero. They were all escorted to the steps of City Hall, where the mayor of New York made a speech of welcome. And while he was doing this, 100 steeplejacks armed with ropes and ladders and pulleys swarmed up to the top of the Empire State Building and lifted the giant peach off the spike and lowered it to the ground. Then the mayor shouted, "We must now have a ticker tape parade for our wonderful visitors." And so a procession was formed, and in the leading car, which was an enormous open-top limousine, sat James and all his friends. Next came the giant peach itself. Men with cranes and hooks had quickly hoisted it onto a very large truck, and there it now sat, looking just as huge and proud and brave as ever. There was, of course, a bit of a hole in the bottom of it where the spike of the Empire State Building had gone in, but who cared about that? Or indeed about the peach juice that was dripping out onto the street. Behind the peach, skidded about all over the place in the peach juice, came the mayor's limousine. And behind the mayor's limousine came about 20 other limousines carrying all the important people of the city. And the crowds went wild with excitement. They leaned out of the windows of the skyscrapers, cheering and yelling and screaming and clapping and throwing out bits of white paper and ticker tape. And James and his friends stood up in the car and waved back at them as they went by. Then a rather curious thing happened. The procession was moving slowly along Fifth Avenue, when suddenly a little girl in a red dress ran out from the crowd and shouted, "Oh, James, James, could I please have just a tiny taste of your marvelous peach?" "Help yourself," James shouted back. "Eat all you want. It won't keep forever anyway." No sooner had he said this than about 50 other children exploded out of the crowd and came running onto the street. "Can we have some too?" they cried. "Of course you can," James answered. "Everyone can have some." The children jumped up onto the truck and swarmed like ants all over the giant peach, eating and eating to their heart's content. And as the news of what was happening spread quickly from street to street, More and more boys and girls came running from all directions to join the feast. Soon there was a trail of children mile after mile, long chasing after the peach as it processed slowly up Fifth Avenue. Really, it was a fantastic sight. To some people, it looked as though the Pied Piper of Hamelin had suddenly descended upon New York. And to James, who had never dreamed that there could be so many children in all, as this in all of the world, thought it was the most marvelous thing that had ever happened. By the time the procession was over, the whole gigantic fruit had been completely eaten up, and only the big brown stone in the middle, lit clean and shiny by 10,000 eager little tongues, was left standing on the truck. Chapter 39. And thus the journey ended, but the travelers lived on. Every one of them became rich and successful in the new country. The Centipede was made vice president in charge of sales of a high-class firm of boot and shoe manufacturers. The Earthworm, with his lovely pink skin, was employed by a company that made women's face creams to speak commercials on television. The Silkworm and Miss Spider, after they had both been taught to make nylon thread instead of silk, set up a factory together and made ropes for tightrope walkers. The Glowworm became the light inside the torch of the Statue of Liberty, and thus saved a grateful city from having to pay a huge electricity bill every year. The Old Green Grasshopper became a member of the New York Symphony Orchestra, where his playing was greatly admired. The Ladybug, who had been haunted all her life by the fear that her house was on fire and her children all gone, married the head of the fire department and lived happily ever after. And as for the enormous peach stone, it was set up permanently in a place of honor in Central Park and became a famous monument. But it was not only a famous monument, it was also a famous house. And inside this famous house there lived a famous person. James Henry Trotter himself. And all you had to do any day of the week was to go and knock upon the door. And the door would always be open to you. And you would always be asked to come inside and see the famous room where James had first met his friends. If you were lucky enough, sometimes you might find the Old Green Grasshopper in there as well, resting peacefully in a chair before the fire, or perhaps it would be the Ladybug who had dropped in for a cup of tea and a gossip, or the Centipede to show off a new batch of particularly elegant boots that he had just acquired. Every day of the week, hundreds and hundreds of children from far and near came pouring into the city to see the marvelous peach stone in the park. And James Henry Trotter, who once, if you remember, had been the saddest and loneliest little boy that you could find, now had all the friends and playmates in the world. And because so many of them were always begging him to tell and tell again the story of his adventures on the peach, he thought it would be nice if one day he sat down and wrote a book. So he did. And that is what you have just finished reading. We always hate seeing books end because we make friends, like we make friends with all of you, along the way through the pages of the books that we read. But they always live on in our memories. The magical words of Roald Dahl in James and the Giant Peach are going to carry with you. But before we say goodbye to the end of this great book, we have come to the favorite part of our show. That's right, let's get crafty. There have been so many magical images that occurred in these final chapters of Roald Dahl's James and the Giant Peach. What were your favorites? Maybe it was when the peach struck the top of the Empire State Building, or when the jet plane went through the cloud and cut all the silk strings, or the ticker tape parade. What was your favorite part of the end of this book? We want you to paint a phenomenal picture of the final pieces of this incredible and phenomenal story. Share your art with us on our social media, at STITCHINGwolf on Facebook and Instagram, or send them to us through email. Kiyaya and I love hearing from you. Get cozy at STITCHINGwolfdesigns.com. Friends, we can't wait to start a new chapter book with you next week. Until then, friends, stay safe and happy and healthy, and always remember, that's right, Kiyaya, reading is power.